Have you ever wondered whether you perceive the world objectively and then put it into words, or whether it's the other way around, that the words that you use shape what you perceive in the first place? In this video, we are going to explore the intriguing relationship between language and perception by scrutinizing various viewpoints and uncover what truly shapes your reality. In a previous video, we investigated whether language determines your ability to conceive thoughts in the first place. But in this video, we'll approach the question from a slightly different angle. Does language shape and even determine how you perceive reality? Or is reality a constant, unaffected by linguistic framing? This question has been debated among philosophers, linguists, and cognitive scientists for centuries, and there are a number of competing viewpoints here. Objectivism assumes that there is an external reality independent of human perception, and that our senses give us a neutral, unfiltered view of that reality. In this view, language is simply a descriptive tool. We hear, see, and experience the world as it truly is, and then we assign words to what we perceive. Do note, however, that we are not talking here about objectivism with a capital O, as defined by Ayn Rand, which encompasses a wider range of philosophical principles including ethics, politics, and individualism. While Rand's objectivism also upholds an independent reality, it emphasizes reason as the sole means of knowledge and rejects the idea that language shapes your perception. In contrast, the broader objectivist view in perception focuses specifically on whether we experience reality in a neutral way before applying language to it. The idea that reality exists independently of our perception was adopted by several thinkers like Aristotle, who viewed perception as a direct reflection of reality, and John Locke, who argued that our senses provide an objective foundation for knowledge. The idea is closely related to philosophical realism, which assumes that the world exists independently of our minds and that our perceptions correspond to that objective reality, reflecting the external world without being fundamentally shaped by language or culture. But does the objectivist view hold? If you think about early humans, before language was developed, there was a time when humans did not speak. They used gestures, facial expressions, and perhaps simple vocalizations to communicate, which would have been sufficient for immediate survival tasks like finding food, avoiding danger, and cooperating in small groups. Now, if our perception of reality is entirely independent of language, then we would expect early humans to have experienced the world in the same way that we do today. However, research suggests that early humans may have perceived reality in a more fluid, less structured, and therefore less segmented way. Without the aid of labels to define anything from colors and objects to abstract concepts, their experience of the world was likely driven more by immediate sensory input and instinct rather than structured thinking. And for me personally, since thinking is my favorite activity, I can only imagine what miserable times those must have been. The evolution of language is a fascinating subject on its own and deserves its own dedicated video. But suffice it to say that the emergence of language allowed humans to contemplate concepts like the future, hypothetical scenarios, or more complex moral dilemmas. As our ability to think and categorize the world evolved, so did questions about how we perceive reality. And this is where the objectivist view was met with challenges. Cognitive scientists and linguists argue that perception is not purely passive. Research in neuroscience shows that perception is an active, interpretive process, not just the passive perception of raw data. Because the brain constantly filters, organizes, and constructs our experience based on prior knowledge and future expectations. This contradicts the idea that we just see reality as it is before putting it into words. Add to that the fact that studies in cognitive linguistics suggest that language affects our ability to categorize the world, which in turn affects perception. For example, the Himba people of Namibia categorize colors differently from English speakers. Their language has multiple words for various shades of green, but lacks a distinct word for blue, often placing it in the same category of greens. This might be influenced by their natural environment, which is dominated by vegetation, meaning that their survival and daily life might depend on distinguishing between various plants, leaves, and the like. As a result, when tested, they could easily differentiate subtle differences between greens that English speakers struggle to see, but they had difficulty identifying a blue square among green ones. This suggests that without a linguistic category for a color, the brain might process it differently, making it less distinct purely through perception, and challenging the idea that we perceive reality in a purely neutral way before applying language to it. But if objectivism does not fully account for perception, then what does? One alternative view suggests that language doesn't just describe reality, it helps shape how we experience it. This idea, broadly known as linguistic relativity, is often associated with linguists Sapir and Worf. According to this view, different languages create different cognitive frameworks which subtly influence what we notice, how we categorize the world, and even what we are capable of thinking about. This indicates that perception is not purely objective and neutral. Instead, it is filtered through the structure of the language that we speak. Now, this does not mean that reality is different for each person, but it does suggest that our cognitive experience of reality is subtly shaped by language. Take, for example, the following scenario. You are about to give a talk in front of a large number of people, and you experience physical sensations like a pacing heart, sweaty palms, and a tight chest. If you describe this experience as anxiety, it reinforces fear and avoidance and puts you in a negative state. Alternatively, if you label it as excitement, you perceive it as rather positive anticipation, which eventually boosts confidence and performance. In both scenarios, the objective reality is the same. You are experiencing a physiological response of elevated heart rate and sweating, but the language that you use to frame it fundamentally shifts your emotional response to it. And if you notice, a similar play on words is often used in politics. When a country declares that it's initiating a military attack, framing it as an invasion implies aggression and possibly unethical action. But when the same action is described as liberation, it suggests bringing freedom and moral justification. Again, in both cases, the reality remains unchanged. A military force is entering another country, but the language used to frame it significantly influences how it is perceived. Words don't just describe reality, they construct the version of it we perceive. The way something is framed dictates emotions, decisions, and even identity. But it is still the case that many researchers also argue that complex thought doesn't depend solely on language. Non-linguistic animals exhibit problem-solving and planning abilities. Think of crows and how they can cleverly solve puzzles that require planning. Same goes for studies conducted on infants who can perceive and react to the world even without language, which does imply that some thought processes can exist independently of linguistic frameworks. A middle ground view between objectivism and linguistic relativity suggests that perception and language are in a feedback loop. We start with a basic pre-linguistic perception of reality, but as we develop language, it reinforces certain distinctions and patterns, shaping what we focus on and how we categorize the world. In other words, we don't just see first and label later. Over time, the labels themselves guide what we continue to notice and remember. That is to say, once language is introduced, it can alter how these pre-existing perceptions are refined into more complex thoughts. Once you have words for something, your brain starts filtering reality through them. But this explanation, convenient as it is, does raise the inevitable question: how much of our conscious experience is limited by language? Because, in essence, while language can expand our world by giving structure to our thoughts, it can also limit us by confining ideas to existing categories. Could we expand our consciousness simply by introducing new words and concepts? For example, if we had a word to describe the feeling of nostalgia for a future you never lived, would that unlock states of awareness that are currently inaccessible to us, given that we never associate nostalgia with future? What if the reality or realities that we are so content with are in fact far more complex than what we reduce them to? For example, studies show that once we label an emotion like anxiety, we feel less controlled by it. But what if this is just an illusion? What if we are reducing something vast and indescribable into a bite-sized concept, one that might distort or limit the original experience? If there can exist an AI that is capable of perceiving patterns in reality that humans will never comprehend because our language, and thus our thought, is inherently limited, would that be a threat or an aid to our survival? Speaking of AI and its remarkable capabilities, it's compelling to assign to it such human attributes as creativity. But is/could AI ever be creative? If you're interested, you could check out this video that I made on this.